Okay, time to finish off the Gospel of Matthew. One chapter left. It's the best chapter. It's a chapter about the resurrection. Certainly wish we had more information about Jesus' appearances after the resurrection, although we do get more in Luke and John. Mark didn't have any. Mark didn't have a single appearance from Jesus at the resurrection. We just heard the message of the angels to the women, and then it ended. And then we had that strange alternate ending, which probably wasn't part of the original manuscript. At least Matthew gives us some. That's one of the things you can tell. That's one of the ways that you can kind of tell what order these Gospels are written in, because each one gives us a little bit more. Each one of us kind of starts a little bit farther back in the narrative, and then each one also carries the narrative a little bit farther at the end. Mark just starts off almost immediately getting into the ministry of John the Baptist, and even skips that pretty quickly in about a paragraph or so. Matthew gives us the genealogy of Jesus and then his birth according to the Jewish patriarchy perspective. Luke goes even back farther than that, gives us the story of John's birth. And then John even goes farther back than that and goes all the way back to the beginning of Genesis and says he was always there. He was with God in the beginning. And then at the end of the Gospels, each one carries the story a little bit farther and includes a little bit more information, which probably, again, is an indicator of what order in which they were written. Matthew 28. After the Sabbath, at dawn on the first day of the week. This is the Sunday after he entered Jerusalem. This is the Sunday of the second week. This is, all of creation up to this point has been waiting for this new week to begin. This is the second week of the new creation. The old creation was done in a week. Remember that in Genesis 1 and 2? This is now the second week, the beginning of the new creation, the second week, the endless day, the forever now. After the Sabbath, at dawn on the first day of the week, Mary Magdalene and the other Mary went to go look at the tomb. They were there for more than just looking at the tomb. Okay, they were there to prepare the body, to further spice up the body with ointments and things like that. Mark 16 says, when the Sabbath was over, Mary Magdalene, Mary the mother of James, and Salome, that's the mother of the Zebedee's son, Zebedee's wife, brought spices so they might go anoint Jesus' body. When it says that they went to go look at the tomb, I think that is a reference to their concern about how they were actually going to get in there. I guess that's in John. They were not, they were not certain how they would actually get into the tomb because it had that heavy stone in front of it, which was in some kind of a niche that it sat down in. I guess it's in Luke. Hang on a second. This is one way in which having all the events in order does make it a little bit easier. I guess it's in Mark. I'm trying. Hang on. I'm going to get there eventually. Yeah, there it is in Mark. Very early on the first day of the week, just after sunrise, they were on their way to the tomb, and they asked each other who will roll the stone away from the entrance of the tomb. Now, they didn't know about the seal. They didn't know about the Roman guards and the seal that had been put there. They were just concerned about how they were physically going to get that stone out of the way. Because it required two men, Joseph of Arimathea and Nicodemus, to put it in place. And even that was easier than removing it because it was put inside, it was slotted into some kind of a niche that would have been buried into the ground. So moving it into place to begin with took two grown men to do that. And moving it away was going to be even harder because they had to get it up out of that niche. And so these women wouldn't have had the physical strength necessary to do that. So I think that's what Matthew is referring to when it says they went to go look at the tomb. They actually went there to bring spices to anoint Jesus' body. But they had the difficulty of physically getting into the tomb to do that because they didn't have the physical strength necessary to move the stone out of the way. And they didn't know about the guards or the seal. That wasn't their concern. They didn't know that had been done. Anyway, there was a violent earthquake. For an angel of the Lord, not the angel of the Lord, but an angel of the Lord, came down from heaven, and going to the tomb, rolled back the stone in silence. That's the answer to their question. An angel's going to move the stone. And he's not moving the stone to let Jesus out. Jesus can get out of the tomb, as we'll see later on. Jesus can move around without being bound to physical space any longer. So he's not rolling the stone out. Even for that matter, he can get out of the grave cloth without needing to physically cut his way out of them. He doesn't need the stone to be removed for him to get out of the tomb. But the women will need, and the apostles will need the stone to be out of the way so they can go back in. For an angel of the Lord came down from heaven, and going to the tomb, rolled back the stone and sat on it. His appearance was like lightning, and his clothes were white as snow. The guards were so afraid of him that they shook and became like dead men. They basically fell unconscious. They fell into some kind of seizure or coma or something like that. The angel said to the women, "Do not be afraid." Now, Mark says that there are two angels. Unusually so, Matthew cuts that down to one. Matthew usually makes one into two. Here are two men in the tombs that were demon-possessed. There were two blind beggars instead of just one, as in Mark and Luke. So Mark usually makes two out of one. In this case, he's cutting two down out of one. In this case, he's cutting two down to one. So he's doing the opposite of what he usually does here. "Do not be afraid," the angel said to the women, "for I know that you are looking for Jesus who was crucified. He is not here. He has risen, just as he said. Come and see the place where he lay." This is the shelf where they had put him in this new tomb that had never been used. That means the new tomb that had never been used means there are no other bodies in this tomb that could be mistaken for his. It would have been empty before he was put in there, and now it's empty again. "Then go quickly and tell us," I'm assuming after this happened, Joseph of Arimathea bought himself another family tomb and never used this one again. I'm assuming. "Come and see the place where he lay. Then go quickly and tell his disciples, he has risen from the dead and is going ahead of you into Galilee. There you will see him. Now I have told you." So the women hurried away from the tomb, afraid, yet filled with joy, and ran to tell his disciples. Now Mark just says they were afraid. And that's pretty much where Mark's gospel ends. Terrified and bewildered, the women went and fled from the tomb. They said nothing to anyone because they were afraid. And that's where the original text of Mark ends. Matthew doesn't end it there. He does say they were afraid. But they were also filled with joy. And they did go tell his disciples. So they didn't say nothing. They didn't not say anything. They did tell his disciples. Suddenly, Jesus met them. "Greetings," he said. They came to him, clasped his feet, and worshipped him. So they were down kind of on their knees, grabbing onto his legs, and worshipped him. Then Jesus said to them, "Do not be afraid. Go and tell my brothers to go to Galilee. There they will see me." Now, I don't know if this is an abbreviated version of his encounter with Mary Magdalene that we read about in John or not. This could be a separate encounter he had. Because we'll read in John that Mary stayed outside the tomb crying after the others had all left, and she was there alone, and she was the actual first person to see Jesus. This could be an abbreviated version of that story, or it could be another encounter that Jesus had with the rest of the women after he had his encounter with Mary Magdalene. Because it seems here that there is more than one woman. In John, it's very clear it's just one. It's Mary Magdalene there alone with Jesus. And she does grab onto him, and he tells her not to hold on to him, not to cling to him. So this sounds a lot like that, so this could be an abbreviated version of that. I'm thinking it probably is. I'm thinking that this is probably Matthew's abbreviated version of Jesus' encounter with Mary Magdalene. But it could be another encounter he had with the other women after he encountered Mary Magdalene, and he encountered the women as they were. It could be. It's hard to say for sure. But my guess is that this is an abbreviated version of his encounter with Mary Magdalene, and John then gives us the full version. There is, I think, a reason why the Gospels kind of, as time goes, again, if we're looking at it as though Mark and Matthew were written first, each in their own way, and then Luke came along and John came along. I think there's a reason why we hear more and more about Mary Magdalene as the Gospels get written, and I'll talk about that when we get more properly introduced to her in the Gospel of Luke. But I'm thinking that this is probably a reference to her encounter with Jesus as recorded in the Gospel of John, and Matthew is simply abbreviating it and making it less about this one individual woman and more about this group. I'm not sure. Matthew is not denying that women were the first to see him. You know, Matthew is very man-focused. It's very Jewish man-focused. Right from the very beginning, he gives us a genealogy of Jesus and to prove that he's the son of David, the son of Abraham, so he's a Jew, and the son of David, so he's a royal Jew. He's a member of the royal line who's going to be king. And that's the way Matthew's gospel starts. Then he gets into the birth narrative and gives it from Joseph's perspective as the adoptive father. Because that's what the Jews of his day needed to hear. Okay, he's writing to Jewish Christians. Maybe to Jews who aren't Christians, but primarily Jewish Christians, or Jews who need to be persuaded of their Jewish Messiah having come. And he is right, and they're very patriarchal in that culture. Now, I didn't say that way. As time went on, nowadays the Jews trace their descent through the mother. But in this day and time, they trace their descent through the father. They're a very patriarchal culture. So Matthew is very, father or man focused. But he doesn't deny. So if any of the four Gospels were going to deny or hide the fact that women were the first witnesses to Jesus' resurrection, it would be Matthew. Because that wouldn't have been. And we do know from later on, when we read Paul's creed, basically in 1 Corinthians 15, about the resurrection, that the church had already, and Paul would have written 1 Corinthians around 50 or so AD, so about less than 20 years later. And they had already kind of developed a creed to summarize their basic beliefs of the resurrection. And they do not mention Jesus' appearance to the women in that creed, because that would have actually been a source of embarrassment. Women were not considered to be reliable witnesses, and their testimony was not valid in that day and culture. So the testimony of women would not have been worth much, if anything. So the fact that women were the first witnesses to the resurrection would have been a source of embarrassment more than anything else. And we know this because from the creed that Paul recites in 1 Corinthians 15, there's no mention of Jesus' appearance to the women. Like that would have been, they could probably tell you that after you'd already become a Christian, but they're not going to lead with that. Okay, the early church witnesses were not going to lead with that information that Christ's first witnesses and his first apostles in that sense were women. They weren't going to, that was not going to be publicly known until maybe after you'd already heard the rest of the story. And so, like I said, Matthew is the most strongly patriarchal of the four Gospels. So if any of the four Gospels were going to downplay or hide the fact that women were the first witnesses to the resurrection, it would have been Matthew. And he may do that here to some degree with Mary Magdalene. Like I said, there may be a reason why Mary Magdalene was kind of hidden from the first couple of Gospels, and we'll talk about that when we get to Luke. But so I think that's probably what this is. Or it could be a separate appearance to the rest of the women after he had already appeared to Mary Magdalene by herself. But my guess is that it's not. It's a summary of his appearance to Mary Magdalene. Anyway, while the women were on their way, some of the guards went into the city and reported to the chief priests everything that had happened. They have to. I mean, they fail in their job. But they're going to say, what are we supposed to do? There's an angel who appeared. What are we supposed to tell them? When the chief priests had met with the elders and devised a plan, they gave the soldiers a large sum of money, telling them, "You are to say," so they're bribing them. They're bribing them to say something. "His disciples came during the night and stole him away while we were asleep." Now, this is a totally ridiculous story. That does not pass the smell test at any level. The guards would not have all been asleep at the same time. If they had let this happen while they were asleep, they would have been in serious trouble and would have been put to death. it's completely illogical to believe that this had happened, but this is what they're being bribed to say because they have no other explanation. If this report gets to the governor, and it will, there's no way it won't, we will satisfy him and keep you out of trouble. I don't know how they did that. Apparently the soldiers were confident that they would, because they did take the money, and they did as they were instructed. Now again, this is a serious threat to these soldiers. If they were found to have been sleeping on the job and had let the apostles take the body while they were there to stop that from happening, they would have been put to death. So either the sum of money they were given by the priest was very large and was worth them risking their lives to tell this lie, or they were confident the priest could keep them out of trouble, and I guess they did. But either way, this story doesn't make any sense. It doesn't pass the smell test at all. But they have no other explanation because they can't get around what happened any other way. So the soldiers took the money and did as they were instructed. And this story has been widely circulated among the Jews to this very day. Now Matthew, of course, is writing in 55 or 57 or somewhere in there A.D. But that story of the body being stolen is still circulated. People still offer that up as an explanation for why the tomb was empty and why the apostles went around preaching the tomb was empty. They just took it. They made the tomb empty by taking the body from it. Then the 11 disciples went to Galilee, to the mountain where Jesus had told them to go. I don't know what mountain that is, but apparently, because they didn't actually tell us the mountain, but apparently they knew where to go. When they saw him, they worshipped him, but some doubted. Now that could be an abridged version of John's account. John will give us an account of Thomas being a holdout. All of them doubted at first. John will make it clear that even after the initial appearance to the women and to Mary Magdalene, and even on the road to Emmaus, and at least read in Luke, they were still hiding out for a couple of weeks for fear of the Jews. So they were still struggling with doubts even after the first reports started circulating that Jesus had risen. And Thomas was a holdout because he wasn't even with the rest of them when the other 10 all saw him. And so he could be referring to that. It could be, again, an abbreviated version of that, and John then later on fills that in and explains more in depth what that is. Or it could be this is a larger group, and it's not just the 11 disciples. The 11 disciples would have been there, obviously. It could be, though, this because we do read in 1 Corinthians also that there was an appearance of Jesus in front of a crowd of 500 plus people, most of whom were still alive in Paul's day, 20 or so years later. And this could be that. Okay, Matthew doesn't himself actually say that, but it could be. We don't have any other example of an resurrection appearance of Jesus that could be that. This could possibly have been that appearance on the mountain with a crowd of his disciples. That is more than just the 11. The 11 would have been there, but it could be a larger crowd that was there and heard this commission at that time. That's possible. Don't know. We really don't know. That's just information that is not clear. Then Jesus came to them and said, "All authority in heaven and on earth has been given to me." Now he had that authority by right of being the creator of the world to begin with. And now he has it even more so by being the savior of the world. So he's the creator of the world and the savior of the world. So he has a double right to authority now. "Therefore go and make disciples of all nations, baptizing them in the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit," the clearest reference to the Trinity in all the Scriptures, "and teaching them to obey everything I have commanded you. And surely I am with you always, to the very end of the age." That's it for the Gospel of Matthew. But there's still more to come. We still have the Gospel of Luke and the Gospel of John to get through. So we're not done with these Gospels. We still have half of them left to go through. We still have quite a bit of information left to go through, too, because a lot of Luke has the material that Matthew and Mark has embedded within Luke, but Luke also has a lot of stuff in it that they don't have. And then John will be almost entirely unique. Almost everything in John is new. A few things overlap with the other Gospels, but a lot of John is completely different from the other three. So we still have a long way to go. Matthew and Mark, in a lot of ways, are basically two versions of the same thing. I've said before that I believe that you could reasonably call both Matthew and Mark the first gospel written, because I think in a certain way they both were. I think Matthew was probably the first gospel, the first attempt at writing down the teachings of Jesus. And that particular version of the gospel is different from the version that we have now that got incorporated into our New Testaments, and probably doesn't exist anymore, and if it does, it was taken by other groups and corrupted by them into something else. But I believe there was a written collection of Jesus' teachings that probably started with Matthew and later got incorporated into the Gospel of Matthew that we have it now, but started out different, so started out separate from that. And I believe that Mark was aware of that when he wrote his Gospel. So he wrote a series of events, he wrote a narrative about the events of Jesus' life, but did not include very many examples of Jesus' teaching. Even though he referred to Jesus as teacher frequently, he did not include very many examples of Jesus' teaching. I think because he knew there was a collection of Jesus' teachings already out there that his audience already had access to and already knew. So therefore, he didn't see the need to include those teachings because they were already available, and what he needed to do was provide a series of a summary of the events of Jesus' life. It could also be, as I said before, that Mark, and certainly Peter, where he got a lot of his teaching from, people believe, and I think is correctly believe, may have been just a man of Peter in particular may have just been a man of action. He may have simply responded to authority in action, and that's what Jesus does in the Gospel of Mark. We see a lot of his actions, we see a lot of his deeds, his authority being expressed through his deeds. And that may just appeal to Peter. Peter may have, and there are some men who are like this. I'm not really. I'm a man who gets excited by teaching. That's why I like the Gospel of Matthew, because it has more teaching in it. Like, that excites me. That excites Matthew. I don't necessarily respond particularly well to like strong authority figures, but some men do. Some men do, and Peter may very well have been one of those men. I mean, everything we read about Peter in the Gospels and Acts, throughout the New Testament, indicates that he was that sort of dude who was action oriented, he was impulsive, and he was probably the older brother of his family, and he liked authority. It seemed like he liked that sort of decisive, active authority, because like I said, some men do. So that may be why Mark got a lot of his stuff from Peter, and wrote his gospel based on Peter's preachings. And that when Peter spoke and gave his preachings, that may have been like what he emphasized. When he talked about his time with Jesus and the things that he saw Jesus do, that may have just been what came out of Peter most naturally, because that's what he remembered the best. That's what he liked the best. And then I think Mark does not include the teachings of Jesus, despite constantly referring to Jesus as teacher a lot. Probably because he knows that those teachings are already written down somewhere and were available to his audience at the time. I think Matthew, then, having written down those teachings, gets inspired by Mark to write his account again, this time with events incorporated into it, and it frames his gospel around those 5 blocks of teaching, and then puts the series of events in between each block of teaching for a specific purpose. And most of those events are already in Mark. If you read the Gospel of Matthew, most of what's in Matthew that is not teaching, that is, a series of events that are occurring, are already in Mark, and they're in Mark in more detailed form. Mark has more details and gives a fuller account of the things that happen. I think Matthew basically took the events in Mark and put them in his Gospel to connect to the blocks of teaching. There are 5 major blocks of teaching in the Gospel of Matthew. And as we saw when we read the Gospel of Matthew, we looked at it, there's, the events that are recorded in the spots where they are there for a reason. So you have the Sermon on the Mount, which is from Matthew 5 to 7, and then afterwards in Matthew 8 and 9, you have a series of stories, all of which I believe are also in Mark, that demonstrate the Sermon on the Mount being put into practice. Then you have Jesus' teachings to his disciples, preparing them for their own ministry, in Mark 10, and then in Mark 11, 12, and 13, I think it is, or 11 and 12, excuse me, you have examples of people's feedback to that, how the public is receiving that message. The stories that Matthew does include are there to highlight the teaching. And so I think you could very easily look at Mark and Matthew as basically two versions of the same thing. They have much of the same material. They relate many of the same events. The biggest difference is that Mark focuses on the actions and gives us more detail about the stories, about the things that happen, and Matthew focuses more on the teachings. His version of events is abbreviated and abridged compared to Mark's, but he gives us long blocks of teaching that Mark does not give us. And so in that regard, I think you can say that both of them were the first gospel written in their own way. And I think both of them could be said to have been aware of the other. I think Mark was aware of a block of teaching, or written teaching that were already out there, and so thus he does not include that material in his text. And I think Matthew, when he writes the Gospel of Matthew as we have today, is aware of Mark's Gospel and is incorporating the narrative contained in Mark's Gospel into his new Gospel and connecting the blocks of teaching that he's already produced in written form to each other through those narratives. It's complicated, but when you dig into it, I think that accounts for how the Gospels got to be the way they are. And I think it accounts very, very well for explaining how the Gospels are the way they are today. Okay, so that's it for Matthew and Mark. Like I said, they're basically two versions of the same thing. And then next we're going to go on to Luke. Well, Luke has the same material in it that Mark and Matthew do, but he also has a lot of material in it that Mark and Matthew do not have. So much of Luke will be new. And Luke is going to have an outside perspective because he is not a Jew. He was not a member of Jesus' movement when it was happening in real time. Matthew was. He was one of the 12 apostles. And Mark was not one of the 12 apostles, but he got his message largely from Peter, who was probably the number one apostle. And Mark himself may have been a member of that wider circle of disciples that followed Jesus around at least occasionally. I mentioned earlier that encounter Jesus had at the end of Matthew may have been the encounter in front of the 500 that's talked about in 1 Corinthians. Well, we don't know who the 500 were, okay, but we know from Luke that we know from some of these passages that he had crowds that followed him around, and we saw in Matthew about how he sends out the 12. We saw that in Mark too. And we'll see that in Luke, but Luke also has another story later on of him sending out 70. Okay, so he had a wider circle of people around him who followed him around. We read about these women at the end of Matthew and Mark, and Luke will introduce them earlier and give them a more prominent role in his gospel. They followed him around a lot too. Okay, so Jesus had, in addition to these 12 individuals that were like his circle, he had a wider crowd of people who followed him around at least part of the time, and Mark very likely was part of that crowd. So Mark, despite not being one of the 12, not only got his message from one of the 12, was probably one of the 500 or so, or that was following Jesus at least part of the time. And at the very least, he would have been a Jew living in that area of the world at that time. So he would have been present in that region of the world during the time the events happened. Like I said, the Last Supper may well have been at his house. Now, he would have been probably a son, a child, a young man. Probably he would not have been the master of the house, but it was possibly very likely the Last Supper was held in his house. So he wouldn't have been totally foreign to it either. Luke is totally foreign. He's not a Jew. He was not present for any of the events. He was nowhere near Jerusalem or Judea at the time that these things happened. He becomes a convert much later on. We first meet him as he relates Paul's missionary journey in Acts 16, when apparently he was living in Troas, and Paul got to Troas and apparently converted him in Acts 16. And that's 20 years or so after Jesus' ministry is over. So Luke is coming to the scene a couple decades later, and therefore has to learn everything about this stuff from other people who did witness it, because he did not witness it himself. So Luke is going to give us an outside perspective, a broader perspective. He's going to start his gospel earlier and take it later than the others did. He's going to give us more information that the others did not have. And he's also going to tell a lot of the same content that Matthew and Mark already did, of course, with a different perspective. And so that's what we're going to get into when we get into the book of Luke.